Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of our listeners wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the Cut the Carbon podcast. We're your link to climate advocates from across the globe, here to let them tell their own stories on fighting the climate crisis. We talk to our guests about climate matters that matter to them and how their countries are cutting carbon emissions. I'm your host, Patricia Manarang. For our episode today, we have Gracious Chirambo from Malawi, who is also our country facilitator for Malawi. Gracious is here to talk about Malawi and climate change, as well as how the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement affects countries with low carbon emissions. Let's hear a snippet from today's episode.
For the US to move out, having already done a lot of havoc, I think it's irresponsible. We think it's irresponsible because the countries that are feeling the biggest repercussions and impacts of climate change is actually us low-emitting countries and poor countries. This basically means that those countries that are polluting the most should contribute more, or should compensate these countries in terms of adapting, but also mitigating these issues.
If you'd like to support this podcast and cut the carbon, don't forget to subscribe to our channels and follow us on our socials, which can be found in the description. This interview has been edited for clarity purposes. Some audio issues may arise due to connectivity problems. Hello, Gracious. Before we actually start with our questions, can you first please introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
All right, thank you. My name is Gracious Chirambo. I'm the country facilitator for Cut the Carbon. Representing Malawi as already introduced by Patricia.
If you're hearing about the Cut the Carbon initiative for the first time through this podcast, you might not know what a country facilitator is. Gracious, as the country facilitator for Malawi, what do you do?
I'm the one leading the discussions here in Malawi, leading the Cut the Carbon initiatives in this country.
Being a country facilitator is a great way to get involved in the climate crisis and engage with your community. But I'll talk more about how you, yes you listener, can sign up to be a country facilitator at the end of this episode. Just like in last week's episode, I want to start by asking how climate change has impacted your country. Are there any specific effects of climate change on Malawi? Is Malawi experiencing any of these for the first time?
Oh yeah, so I think before I answer the question specifically, I think there are a few facts that I have to give about Malawi. The first thing is to say that the economy of Malawi is highly reliant on land-fed agriculture. About 80% of the population in Malawi is employed in the agriculture sector. 75% of that population is smallholder farmers. And those smallholder farmers, I think this is very important, they do produce the biggest chunk of what Malawi does consume. In terms of the rain-fed agriculture, we only have one season in Malawi, one rainy season that runs from somewhere November up to April, and that is very important because that will give you specific idea of what are the real specific issues of climate change in Malawi. So for the past few years, of course, we from maybe 1976 up to 2006, we had at least 3 to 4 droughts. But in the past probably 10 years, we have been having droughts at least every year. Drought is the first one. The second one that I can talk about is flooding. Because the rains do come, these days they come late. Maybe instead of starting in November, the usual like this year, they've started in January. And then they stop somewhere around March. So because they come late, they become very intense during January and February, thereby having a lot of impacts on our crops that we produce. As you can see, that this is a country that does rely on so much on agriculture. This means that once you have flooding, you have droughts, you are directly impacting poverty levels in the country. You are impacting economic growth in the country. You are impacting long-run growth of the country. Also, that has an impact on the vulnerable groups, especially women and children, especially with the flooding. Women, especially in Malawi, usually seen as domestic workers. They don't really go to school. So when you have more flooding, they are more responsible for other productive work activities and focus on taking care of the family.
That's a very important thing you pointed out. Even if some countries experience harsher impacts due to their geographical location or what their economy is reliant on, there are still groups within those countries that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Women and children, among other groups, may be more vulnerable to climate change because of societal discrimination or gender norms or other factors. So, speaking of groups, what would you say the state of climate advocacy is in Malawi? Are there organizations that focus on addressing different aspects of the climate crisis, and do they face any certain challenges?
Fortunately, in the country, we are much aware of the impact and repercussions of climate change to an extent that the government has taken a serious initiative to put in place institutional and legal frameworks of advocating for practices that are sustainable and climate change friendly. There are a number of groups that are involved in that. There is a Center for Environmental Protection Agency and others. But the new problem that we are facing in the country is usually the financing for these advocacies. So, for example, the government now encourages that every year people do go and engage in tree planting. They say how to get the seedlings, how to finance that, considering that our budget is already constrained. In terms of awareness, people are aware but not so much aware. However, the biggest majority of the people in Malawi are in the villages and they do not understand the impacts that the deforestation has on climate change in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So those are the issues that are there, but the government has taken a serious stance to advocate for climate change, in that this stance does translate into civil society organization also taking a part and parcel. But in short, the real problem is financing, as well as public awareness on the same. But also, as we'll see, I think we have had little support from international, especially high-emitting countries.
So, the main threats to climate advocacy in Malawi are lack of funding and public awareness, which I think are two common issues we face in the global south. There's also the lack of support from countries with higher carbon emissions. What is the government of Malawi doing exactly to help climate advocates through these challenges?
Maybe I should just give a little bit of the strategy that the government has deployed. One, they're trying to build capacity at the individual level. Each and every person should understand the implications and repercussions of climate change and then take an active role in terms of dealing with it. The second one is where they are talking about institutional capacity building, institutional support. That's where the issues of youth initiatives and organizations fall. Then there is another part where they are talking about the mobilization of resources to do that. The third one, this is the one that is the real problem, because this one, the mobilization of resources, the government does have the capacity a little bit to mobilize resources. But for a country like Malawi, there are also other seriously pressing issues. Apart from that, they look up to the issues of health, food, issues of education. They look at them as immediate. You know how climate manifests itself. It's not that people would see directly, but when they miss a meal, they will see it directly. And then it also attaches to politics. So politicians would prefer to address this issue of food immediately than addressing the issue of empowering or capacitating youth-led organizations. So in general, I would say on paper, the government is doing enough in terms of advocating for that, but they're not providing the necessary support for young people and the youth organization to go forward and help in terms of combating climate change.
Thank you, Gracious, for giving us a look into the climate crisis in Malawi and what the advocacy landscape looks like. Let's talk about some recent international events in climate. As of the recording of this episode, the US just announced that they're pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Current President Donald Trump made a similar announcement during his previous term in 2017, but it took some time for this to come into effect. The next President Joe Biden then made the US rejoin it in 2021, and now Donald Trump has made the move to leave yet again. This is a move that affects not only the United States, but the entire world. What was your reaction when you heard of this news? How did your peers there in Malawi react?
I'd say it's not surprising with President Trump, because last time he had also expressed intent of pulling out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. When we heard that the president Trump was warned, we knew what exactly we should expect in terms of climate change because he had called it in the past that it's a hoax. What we feel I think this feeling is also shared by my fellow youth and the climate change activists, that it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because for a long time, the USA and the other highly industrialized countries, they have emitted a lot into the atmosphere that needs to be taken out to begin with, but also needs to be dealt with. For the US to move out, having already done a lot of havoc, I think it's irresponsible. We think it's irresponsible because the countries that are feeling the biggest repercussions and impacts of climate change is actually us low-emitting countries and poor countries. This basically means that those countries that are polluting the most should contribute more or should compensate these countries in terms of adapting but also mitigating these issues. For the government, I don't know how they deal with it, but we think that it's important that the president should reconsider his decision for the benefit of everyone and for the benefit of his country as well. For us low-emitting countries, we feel like high-emitting countries do owe us. And this is a serious drawback. I hope we get a better alternative than what he has done. If he has issues with how the agreement is being implemented or how it affects America, he should probably just deal with those issues than just pulling out outright.
It's a recent move, but we know it will have repercussions. How do you predict this move will affect climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts in low-emission countries? Will it make implementation more difficult, or will we lose funding?
As to immediate repercussions of what has happened, we are not yet experiencing them because this happened maybe 2 weeks ago. But we know for sure that it will sting in the near future. For Malawi, basically, we have what we call the Millennium Development Challenge. This is funded by the USA. This challenge basically looks at funding green energy sources. So we are talking about hydroelectricity and funding rural areas. The project is very good in that it will reduce deforestation because the rural majority doesn't rely so much on firewood as a means of energy for cooking and other things. Secondly, it does release the pressure from the government to invest in greenhouse gases energy sources. Having been funded by the United States of America and the United States of America not committing anymore to funding it, we feel like this program may not actually continue. And what that means is that we drill ourselves in the process of mitigation and adaptation. And it's very unfortunate if that happens. So that's why I'm saying maybe the US will consider its stance because for climate change, obviously, very soon we'll start feeling the effects of it. Yeah, I think I would say that because already in the health sector, we are already feeling the pinch. I think as of this week, most people have lost their privilege of getting free drugs for things like HIV and all that. We hope this will not happen in the climate change area.
So we talked about the potential effects the US pulling out of the climate agreement has on low-emitting countries. It's also worth discussing the other countries with high carbon emissions. Should they step in? What should they do to address what the United States did?
If it was easy, what we would have said is high-emitting countries should consider raising up their contributions to the initiative, but considering how difficult it might be and the pressure it might put on their needs and national plans, maybe the best way for them would be to negotiate with the President of the United States to reverse his decision, or maybe take him back to the drawing table and say, okay, we understand your concerns, but would you please understand and maybe appreciate what the climate change experts are saying? What is more worrying is that he's saying that climate change is a hoax. So it's basically we are starting from a standpoint where he doesn't believe that the climate change is happening. I think that's the most difficult part of it. But the countries like China, because they are the biggest emitters, they should stand up and maybe also raise the funds that they are contributing to the fight against climate change. But for Western countries, because they are allies of the USA, they can talk to the USA and maybe reach an agreement. That's what we can say. That's what we can hope can happen.
Yes, I'm so tempted to say we can only hope when it comes to larger countries with more resources and higher carbon emissions stepping in and actually doing something or saying something. But we have to remain positive and keep putting pressure on these countries for the sake of our future and our children's and grandchildren's futures. So, before we end today's episode, would you like to promote anything, Gracious?
Okay, so yeah, maybe just one. I think very soon we'll be opening Cut the Carbon Malawi chapter, so we can interact with people. I hope the podcast can also be posted there, so that we can interact with the colleagues in Malawi. But also, I'll be engaging. I think very soon. Yeah, after we discuss, I'll be engaging youth organizations which are dealing with issues of climate change, but also all other organizations. I'm now compiling a database for those organizations so that two together we can engage in fruitful discussion that contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation, but also put pressure on the government and the international partners to help us in our initiatives.
Thank you so much for today, Gracious. I really enjoyed talking to you and learning more about Malawi and climate change. That was such an informative and insightful episode. Today, we talked to Gracious Chirambo from Malawi about the specific effects the climate crisis has on Malawi, the potential impacts the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement has on low-emitting countries, and what the global north should do about it. At the start of the episode, we mentioned country facilitators. If you're interested in becoming one, you can visit the links listed in the description. You can also request Zoom calls with me, and we can talk more about the responsibilities and the cool opportunities you'll get as a country facilitator. Let us know your thoughts about this episode in the comments or through our social media. We'd love to start a discussion with you about today's episode. In our next episode, we talk to Malak Al-Taib from Libya about energy security, so keep your ears peeled for that. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Follow our Instagram at cut.thecarbon, our Blue Sky at cutthecarbon.bsky.social, and our LinkedIn Cut the Carbon. Visit our website cutthecarbon.eco to learn more about us. Thank you for tuning in. Never forget that the climate crisis isn't fought alone or through only one way. Bye! See you next time!